What's going on, everybody? I'm Jay Ray. I know it's been a little while, but I'd like to welcome you back to another episode of Jay Ray and the Jeep. In this episode, I'm going to be changing the shocks on my 2000 TJ. Forgive me, it's a little bit dirty. It's kind of windy out here where we're at, kind of in the desert area. So it's kind of dirty. I haven't had a chance to wash it off, but I need to get these shocks changed. So we're going to get into that right now. For my Jeep, I chose to go with the 5100 series shocks from Bilstein. I'm not sure how you pronounce it correctly, but they should be a pretty good shock. I've got them on other vehicles and they work really well. My Jeep does have a 3.5 inch lift. You need to make sure if you do these shocks on your Jeep that you get the correct shocks for the amount of lift that you have and the style of Jeep you have. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to lift up the front of this Jeep on the passenger side so I can change this shock, and then we'll move to the rear. Now the first thing I got to do on this Jeep is jack it up so I can take the tires off. In order to change this shock, we've got a nut on the top right here, and we've got 2 bolts on the bottom that we need to take out. It should be that simple. Take out these 2 bolts and take off this nut on top to get the old shock out. I'm going to spray these bolts with a little bit of lubricant before I try to take them loose. Hopefully the penetrating oil can get in there and loosen them up for me. And it looks like I might be able to open the hood and access this top bolt from under the hood. So I'm going to go ahead and open the hood. So I had to remove the air cleaner on my Jeep to get access to this hole right here. This hole is the access to get to the bolt or nut that's on top of the shock. These 2 bolts on the bottom of the shock go through this plate. They've got nuts on the bottom. So I've sprayed the bottom with the penetrating oil. Hopefully that'll loosen them up. I'm going to get a wrench and a socket and see if I can bust those loose. A couple ways you can tell your shocks are worn. One is if it pushes in super easy, which this one does. I was able to pull it out of there as soon as I got the nuts off, and it's real easy. It's a 15 millimeter on the top and 2/13s on the bottom. Also, you can tell the hydraulic fluid has run out of this shock a little bit. It's pretty nasty, but it should bounce back a lot quicker than what this is doing right here, and it shouldn't be that easy to push. So here's the old shock. It's got a flat washer, 2 rubber grommets, another flat washer, and a nut on top. The new Bilstein shock did come with 2 new flat washers, 2 new rubber grommets, and a new nut going for the top. But I can tell that the diameter of the shaft on the Bilstein is a little bit bigger than the shaft that came off the old shock, because the diameter of the nut is just a little bit larger. So to get this installed, I'm going to have to do it in the opposite order. I'm going to put these flat washer and the rubber grommet on, push it up through the mounting bracket on the top, put the other grommet, flat washer on, and then put the nut on from the top. So it came with the new nut for the top of the shock, but it didn't come with bolts and nuts for the bottom. So I'm going to have to reuse the old nuts and bolts that came off the bottom of the shock to hold this in place. It was quite a bit tougher to push that shock up into place than it was to pull the old one out. So I can tell that this shock is going to perform a lot better than what the old shock was doing, because the old shock was definitely wore out. the holes lined up to push the bolts through. Now I can put the nuts on. Nothing works the way you think it will the first time. May have got my wrench stuck. I gotta get that out. So it really is that simple to change out your shock on your vehicle. I only had 2 bolts on the bottom, and then the one nut at the top that I had to take loose. Put the new shock in, tighten up the nut on the top, and tighten up the 2 bolts on the bottom. Once they're good and tight, torque them to spec. You gotta look up your vehicle for the specs on your own vehicle, but I just tightened them as much as I could. They're good and tight for me. Now I gotta put the tire back on, and we'll move to the rear. So these rear shocks are designed a little bit different. There's 2 bolts up on the top and then 1 bolt down here on the bottom that holds it onto the bracket on the axle. I'm going to be taking this apart without showing you the top because I can't really get my camera up in there to show you how it's going between the gas tank and the frame rail here. I do have a little concern though, is that right here on the shock you can see this little dent right here. It looks like that it was hitting this mount for the spring. So I hope that my new shocks don't do that when I get them installed, but I'm a little concerned about it because of the way this shock looks here. So on this bolt on the bottom of the shock, you gotta have a 15mm wrench and an 18mm socket, and then the 2 bolts that are at the top of the shock is a 13mm. Okay, so my phone died last night when I was trying to record this. I ended up getting all the shocks on. Sorry I didn't record it. The rears were definitely harder than the fronts, but they are on there. It looked pretty good. I found a way on this rear to make it a little bit easier on myself. That first one was pretty difficult, but what I ended up doing was putting my jack stand underneath the axle on the lowest setting possible, and then I ended up jacking up on the frame, and that ended up letting the axle drop by the spring pressure, and I was able to get this shock bolted in place pretty easy doing it that way. So my rear shocks on this Jeep were a little bit worse than what the fronts are. The front shocks, you can push them in pretty easy. Shouldn't be that easy to push in. The new ones are definitely not that easy. But if you can see that, the front shocks actually do come back up over time. It's a little bit slow, but that's better than what the rear shocks were doing. So the rear shocks, you grab them and you push them in, and they stay. That definitely was not helping the performance or the ride quality on my Jeep. So if your shocks are like this, you definitely want to take a look at getting them changed out. So now I guess the only thing left to do is take you for a little test drive and see how it rides. Alright, here we go, the first test drive with the new shocks on. See how it does. Get out of the garage here first. I am a little concerned, it was tight getting in here. I think the Jeep sits a little bit higher. Now we're trying to pull it out. So I'm gonna have to watch the roof while we try to squeeze by this trailer here. This is the bar that I'm concerned with right here. Is it still looking good?
Now.
I don't feel anything, don't hear any scraping.
We did it.
That was like a perfect fit. I think I might have had about a 1-inch clearance. On my Jeep, I'm going to be using these Bilstein 5100 series shocks. They're pretty good aftermarket shock. They're better than performance. They're better than performance.